Hi guys, welcome to another camera techniques tutorial. This session we're going to be going over focal lengths and what that means. So what are focal lengths? If you look here on this lens, it says here it's from 70mm to 200. So what that actually means is if I'm at 70mm, the angle of view is a little bit wider and we can see more. Whereas the more I increase this focal length to 200mm, it's a little bit more zoomed in. On the other end of the spectrum, we have this is a 12mm lens. So this is more close to a fisheye, and it's a completely wide angle field of view, much wider than we can even see with our own eyes. So this is comparable to a GoPro lens or an action camera or something like that. Now, one of the characteristics that we get using a wide angle lens is that it exaggerates proportions and gives you a real exaggerated sense of perspective. Now this might be useful for architectural shots, landscape shots, or anything where you want to get a real wide, big field of view. Whereas telephoto lenses or zoom lenses such as this one, which is anything typically from 70mm or above, these are a much narrower field of view and give you a much more zoomed in perspective. One effect this can have is actually compressing the foreground with the background. So for example, if I had a wide angle lens and I was doing a shot at night time in a field with a person stood in front of the moon, through the wide angle lens the moon might look like a tiny dot in the night sky and the person would look very large in the foreground. Whereas if I then walked back to the other side of the field with a zoom lens, I'd have to walk to the other end of the field just to fit the person in because it's a really zoomed in lens. This would actually also really magnify the moon, obviously. So the end result with this lens would be perhaps a person stood inside the moon, making the moon look really huge compared to the person, or really close to the person, whereas this lens would have the opposite effect. It would actually make them seem even further away from the moon and the moon would look tiny. So what other scenarios might this come in handy? For example, if I was shooting a scene in a nightclub and I had limited access to extras or actors, and say I had a big open space, a big dance floor, but I only had 5 extras in there, and I wanted to make it look like it's a really popping off busy nightclub. What I would do is I would not go for the wide angle lens because this would obviously show the big spaces between them. You'd have a wide field of view, you'd see lots of empty space. So what I would do is go for a longer lens, perhaps not this long. So we've got 12mm here, 70 here. This might be a bit too zoomed in. So maybe something in between, perhaps a 50mm would be more ideal. And what this would do is actually compress the foreground and the background. Because we're cropping in on the scene, it would get rid of all that empty space and it would make the frame look a lot busier, a lot more action-packed. One last interesting difference between a wider focal length and a longer focal length is the effect that this tends to have on the depth of field. So obviously this varies depending on f-stops, which f-stop you're using, but we won't go over that today. But in general, the wider angle the lens, the more that tends to be in focus all the time. This makes a wide angle lens ideal for run and gun shooting because you can just set it to infinity and more than likely almost everything is in focus, even things that are relatively close to you. Whereas a more zoomed in or telephoto lens, this actually exaggerates the properties of depth of field a lot more. So you'll get a lot more of that blurry background effect behind your subjects, which is a great, nice, polished look. It's a really nice professional look and feel to have to a shot. But at the same time, if you're running and gunning, it means you have to be really precise to get that focus point just right. So it might not be ideal for that. So a lot of people go for the standard range of focal length, which is below 70mm and above around 17 or 18mm. So a 50mm would fall into that category. 50mm tend to have a narrow depth of field by the nature because they're prime lenses, but at the same time they have that nice balance of you're able to get lots in focus when you need it all in focus, and at the same time they're versatile because you can actually also shoot with a very narrow depth of field as well. So in summary, what would I mainly use a telephoto or zoom lens for? If I wanted to make a scene look really crowded, really tight, action-packed, lots of people, exaggerate the amount of people that might be in the shot, this would be good for that because it compresses the background and the foreground together. Also for nature photography, and all sorts of David Attenborough wildlife shooters would use a lens like this or much longer. That's an example of what I'd use a long focal length for. What would I use a wide angle for? Now this would be obviously great for architectural work, so there might be a really small room that I'm trying to show off and make look as good as possible. This would be ideal because it's got a wide field of view. I can fit everything in. Also, anything action with like skateboarding or sports, extreme sports, this is often used to exaggerate distances, jumps, and things like that. It's just a good all-rounder for capturing those big, wide shots. Now, a more standard lens, or one that falls within 17mm up to 70mm, such as this 50mm lens, this is a really handy lens for all kinds of situations. So if I'm shooting on a job, typically I tend to have a lens that falls into this range on my camera for most of the day, because most of the shots, like this interview for example, is shot on a 28mm lens here. It's just a good all-round focal length range. And also these lenses don't distort a sense of perspective or scale like a wide angle or a longer focal length would. They kind of show the world as we see it through our own eyes. So they're really good for just general documenting and general purpose use.